We have a little time left, and I thought I'd sum up the event or some of the issues we've talked about, and forgive me if I'm a little repetitive about what we've talked about before, but I know there are probably some more questions out there, and I encourage you to stay and share your questions or comments, because this is your time. But some of this is dispiriting to hear about, isn't it? But if there's anything that Judicial Watch should tell you, is that there is a way forward. The government is out of control, and off the rails here in Washington, D.C. or elsewhere. But we're showing there is a way to take the government back, to bring it back down to earth, bring it back down under control, whether it be the Freedom of Information Act, whether it be litigation that we're pursuing otherwise against government officials over misconduct. There is a way to get it under control. The Obama administration has to come into court and answer to Judicial Watch's complaints. That's a wonderful thing. Nothing else like that is going on in Washington, D.C. Congress negotiates subpoenas with the administration or requests for information. Those are politicians negotiating back and forth over what records will be made available to Congress, who may or may not make those records then available to the American people. We bypass that, and we have a direct access to the federal courts that require documents to be turned over to the American people directly through Judicial Watch. That's a wonderful thing. So things are difficult, but there is a way forward. And if we had different leaders in Congress or in the presidency, my view is you have leaders that start talking about these issues the way we think about them, you'd have a very different response from the American people and maybe dramatic reform here in Washington, D.C., and we wouldn't have to do all the heavy lifting seemingly alone. As Paul was highlighting, we work with other organizations. We're highlighting and helping other organizations, telling them to do more of what Judicial Watch does. We ask about everything that we find interesting, potentially corrupt, and that covers a lot of issues. But we're not expert in everything. We don't propose. I'm not a federal bureaucrat. I don't think I know everything. But there are other organizations who follow some of these issues closely, and we try to help them ask questions about issues they care about and affect their missions by getting material about whether it be climate change or the takeover of financial markets by the Bush/Obama administrations. Those are things that we're always happy to help others do. And you can do these laws, you can work on these issues yourself. There's nothing preventing you individually from asking for records under the Freedom of Information Act at the federal level, and certainly at the state level. The closer the government is to you, like a Board of Education or a city council or mayor or a Department of Sanitation, boy, the more trouble you cause by asking under your state's record laws for documents that you want information on. And as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing too petty to ask about. If it's sticking in your craw, what the government's doing locally, you should be asking questions about it. I don't know if Bob Popper got into this issue on the election integrity, but as we've noted before, local officials, state officials are required to take reasonable steps to make sure the election rolls are clean. Now, federal law requires that anyone who asks for that information about what steps they're taking to clean up the rolls be made available. It's not the Freedom of Information Act, it's another law that is it's an open records type law. There's nothing preventing you from asking your Secretary of State or your county election officials what steps they're taking to clean up the election rolls. Are they taking steps to remove deceased individuals from the rolls or people who moved away from the rolls? Are they taking reasonable steps to do that? We've uncovered in many jurisdictions where they got more people in the rolls than are living there. That's a pretty good indication they're not taking the steps necessary to clean up the lists when they've got dead people on the voting rolls or people who moved away or non-citizens. There's nothing preventing you individually from taking those steps to find out more about what's going on in your local community. The same goes on immigration matters. Every town's a border town. I don't need to tell you that. But is your town doing things to provide sanctuary to illegal aliens? Are they using your tax dollars, for instance, to set up day labor sites where illegal aliens can get illegal work? You can raise those issues. Find out how many illegal aliens are in your schools. They may not want to tell you and pretend the law prevents you from telling you that, But those are things that you can do individually. And of course, your congressmen always come home to learn what you care, to learn what you're concerned about. Go to those town halls, raise these issues. And I can guarantee you, talking about corruption, talking about transparency, the crowd will be with you in any town hall that you attend. And I can tell you, the congressmen use these town halls as barometers as to what to worry about and what to do. And they come back and they tell the leadership, this is what I'm hearing, we need to address this issue. And there's a reason the Iran deal went the way it did in the House, not because the House wanted to do anything and more aggressive against the Obama's position on it. And as we pointed out, as many have pointed out, some of it was a kabuki theater, but they did that in response to concerns from the American public. I remember during the Bush administration where we were battling them on FOIA issues and transparency and Bush secrecy. Remember how terrible Bush secrecy was? Well, George Bush ended up signing a Freedom of Information Act reform law. This is, the same administration that had Dick Cheney essentially telling us that we couldn't access information about what lobbyists were talking to the Interior Department. And that was the same type of information that the president might receive about where the bomb in a war. I mean, just this crazily expansive view of secrecy. But President Bush ended up having to sign a reform legislation because things got so out of hand, because the public was against him on this issue. So there are many opportunities that you can pursue besides supporting Judicial Watch directly that are Judicial Watch-like. You can be a one-man, one-woman Judicial Watch. And feel free to invoke our name in vain in some respects. The Judicial Watch has highlighted that the law requires that government officials like you respond to these requests for information. Why aren't you doing it? I'm going to tell Judicial Watch what you did. We may not be able to do anything or may not even see your letter in time, but who knows? It might scare someone into doing something. So I encourage you to take those issues that you're learning about here and follow up on them. Write your letters to the editor. Comment on Facebook. Comment on Twitter. Get other people talking about it. We don't need to be in the New York Times or on ABC or CBS if you're doing this work within your own communities. And I can tell you, the Obama administration has no way of controlling the new media out there. So you should take that up. Do your own media work. Do your own reporting. As you know, there are many citizen journalist sites that are cropping up. Stay factual, stay accurate. Don't engage in personal attacks. And I tell you, there's a thirst for information, a thirst for leadership on these issues as well. And reinforce this issue with the politicians who come begging for your support. My guess is you're the activist class in your community. That's why you're here. And so you're seeing these politicians more than most average Americans. You need to talk to them about these issues. Let them know that this is the important issue. I mean, we may be talking about tax reform with an IRS run the way it's run. I mean, that to me is like, the house is burning down and you're talking about what to put in the kitchen. It's completely irrelevant to the crisis at hand. And until we get the government back under control, a lot of the legislative things that we're talking about, or reforming this and reforming that, is just ridiculous. Because the rent seeking that goes on in this town, the benefits, every piece of legislation has someone who wins and loses in a way that has nothing to do with good public policy. Until we have a different approach in government, all the policy changes you hear from both sides of the aisle are irrelevant. Imagine if a politician got up there on issues that we care about. So, well, I don't know about climate change, but all I know is it's corrupt. I don't know about Obamacare. All I know is that it's corrupt. I don't know about tax reform, but I'm sure it's going to be corrupt. Who's going to disagree with that? I think a lot of Democrats might agree with that. A lot of liberals would agree with it as well. I mean, that ought to be the discussion about the corruption in Washington, D.C. $4 trillion spent with virtually no oversight. I can tell you how often I've gone up on the Hill. I remember just recently there was a big IRS thing we had done, and we had some documents about a particular issue. And I saw that one of the investigative committees was going to have a hearing. And it looked like it might be on the issue that we were looking at. And I was like, well, I need to go up and make sure, are they going to talk about the documents we have? Do they have that information? Or, just let them know about it. And of course, within a minute and a half, I realized they didn't have any of the information we had and had no plans to talk about it. They were going to talk about a report that someone else had done, complaining vaguely about something that may or may not have happened at the IRS. Not terribly interesting. And they had nothing of the documents we had. And I thought, my gosh, what am I wasting my time coming up here for time and time again? But on the other hand, it is Congress after all. We have to do the work. And it sometimes feels like you're banging your head against the wall, but you need to be in constant communication with your congressman and your senator. And believe me, the phones, even if they're not picked up, they know how often they're ringing, especially when things get hot and heavy in the Capitol. Call your congressman, shut the phone lines down. These are the types of things you need to be active in terms of, especially as issues come to the fore, and getting your networks active in that area. It has an impact. Believe me, this is what the staff members tell you if you ask them in off-the-record sessions. Call. Don't worry if the phones aren't answered, because if the phones aren't answered, it means they're being overwhelmed, and they note that they're being overwhelmed. They draw those conclusions. So this is a big opportunity for you, and you're doing the Lord's work, obviously, in my view, in supporting Judicial Watch. But the vigilance has to extend to your activism at home. And to the degree you're able to do that, you should try to do that. There are people out there putting their lives on the line for us right now. And so this is, I think, the least we could do in terms of the government vigilance. And we deserve to know what our government is up to. And don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise. There's a quote I'll paraphrase before I open it up by one of the founding fathers. And he says, we have a right, a God-given right, an inalienable right to that most prized yet dangerous knowledge, that of the conduct and character of our rulers. We don't want to know, but boy, is it important that we know what our rulers are up to. And they work for us. Don't you ever forget it. Let John Boehner know he works for us. Let your members of Congress know they work for us. And don't be put off if there's a Democrat, because the Democrats are as sensitive to these political winds as anyone else. And transparency and anti-corruption, talk about that with them. As I said earlier today, Elizabeth Warren, she talks about that. Think of the language that the other side uses in these issues and use them for your own purposes. Transparency, no one's against that. We've done the polling. It's a 75% issue. Even immigration, the rule of law in immigration. We have our polls show majority of Hispanics want that, don't like sanctuary cities. 40% want to deport everyone the way Donald Trump is threatening to do. Don't be cowed by the media's way of talking about these issues. With the pride that you are in the right and the confidence that you have a right to be heard, you should be making these issues known any way you can to the degree you're able. And of course, Judicial Watch will continue this hard work. These Clinton email scandal is running hard and is moving along so fast that I don't even want to go back to the office and find out what happened today. The IRS scandal, we have thousands of documents we're still looking at. Benghazi, we have documents that we're still looking at. The Clinton cash, we still have documents we're looking at. Obamacare, we have documents we're looking at. Immigration, documents we're looking at. So none of these issues are going away. And so we're going to continue to make news and hold the government's feet to the fire on this, because no one else is willing to do that. I can tell you, Congress is completely incapable of doing this. You know, I had a meeting up on the Hill with Chris Farrell, who was here earlier. And we met with a high-ranking chairman on the Hill. This is after the new Congress just recently. And we had the typical meeting, and Chris made the comment. He said, well, the good thing is that the chairman or whatever member showed up. The bad news, it went as every other meeting went. We say, why don't you do this? Why don't you do this? And they look at us like saying, we're not doing any of that. If you have anything politically feasible we can do, let us know. Politically feasible. I'm talking about holding people in contempt who are violating law, who aren't complying with congressional subpoenas, and they're saying that's not politically feasible. I'm talking about, well, if you don't want to impeach Obama, is there someone else in the bureaucracy you might want to try impeaching? What's politically feasible? Why don't you enforce your own contempt powers as opposed to relying on the Justice Department, as we've noted earlier, as Joe Geneva noted earlier? Why don't well, I had a member say, well, what are we going to do, hire all these police to... They have 10,000 police officers on the Capitol. They don't want to do any of it. And you need to make it clear this is what you expect them to do, and stop blowing smoke in your ear about what they're doing to combat the Obama agenda. Because what they're doing is they're funding Obama's lawless agenda. They're not combating it, they're funding it. They fund the lawlessness, they fund his willingness to rewrite the law, they fund his programs that release criminal aliens out onto the streets, they fund his rewrite of Obamacare, they fund everything they inveigh against. So don't you be fooled by anything else. So with that happy note, I'll turn it over. But my point being, we can't solve the problem unless we're direct as to what it is. And by saying it's a problem, there are just too many liberals. No, that's not the problem. That the changes in policy would fix it. That's not. We have to have a fundamental rethink about how this government operates and whether or not it's going to comply with the law and whether or not Congress is going to start doing the job it was entrusted to do by our constitutional system. And whether this president is going to feel that he needs to obey the Constitution and his oath of office, and whether the judges are going to be interpreters and apply the law, or whether they're going to use their position to oppress us. I don't know if we talked about the gay marriage decision today, but I think it's worth remarking upon. There you had a 5-4 decision by Justice Kennedy, and I'm not a lawyer, but I've read enough Supreme Court decisions. I remember reading his decision and finishing it and saying, is that it? Is that it? Usually I have to skip over whole sections of law. Since I'm not a lawyer, I don't need to know the law. There weren't sections of the law to skip over by Justice Kennedy. But I can tell you that we can't even contemplate the sort of totalitarian government that is going to have to impose this decision on us. Because Justice Kennedy essentially said, if you don't endorse gay marriage, you are outside the law, you're the equivalent of a racist, and with statements and implications like that, if you're a Christian or have any traditional religious faith or any traditional sense at all, who decides that I object to the idea that a federal court, a Supreme Court, can impose or rewrite the basis of Western civilization by fiat, you will be targeted. If you're a public official who opposes that, you will be targeted and potentially jailed. And there's a push in Congress to rewrite or change the law to provide freedoms for those of us who might object to this and protections. But my gosh, what a defensive action. So we have to go to federal court to protect our core constitutional rights. It's not even a constitutional right, it's a human right. That decision is invalid, should be resisted under law, and should be overturned. That should be the approach, as opposed to saying, well, it's the law of the land. Well, it isn't. It's not good law. And it should be overturned. Why are we presuming that it's valid? And it's going to lead to totalitarianism. You know, these are sorts of the inconvenient things we don't like to talk about. I recall a House member just recently talking about, well, the judges, we can't allow, the Senate shouldn't approve any more of Obama's judges. Fine. Well, you know, when there's a judicial vacancy, you know what the House can do? Defund the position, so there's no vacancy for the president to appoint a judge to. You say that to a congressman, they fall on the floor. It's just completely outside their way of thinking. So, and don't think just because you thought about it and you think it's a good idea and you haven't seen it validated or written down anywhere else or promoted by a politician or a talking head, that it's a bad idea. You have good ideas, and you should not be ashamed to share them. When people tell me stories about what the government's doing and what's happening, I believe everything. I have people who have actually read laws I haven't read and said, you know what's in there? I said, I didn't know what's in there. They're not experts. They just read the law. So don't underestimate the value of your contribution to the public debate, your ideas and strategies, and don't feel, and please, just remember, I'm telling you to go out and share what you're doing and what you're thinking, and you be reformers as well. So thank you very much.